Okay, we're connected. Everything seems to be working. Spent the last few days digging out from a big snowfall.
It's 6 o'clock.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Okay, last week we finished up a series on the five aggregates, and I thought a very logical extension to that would be to do 3 weeks on the three aggregates, dukkha, anicca, anatta. So this evening I want to talk about the characteristic of anatta, of dukkha. First of all, just a general remark on the classification of the three aggregates, or the three characteristics, the tilakkhana, or three marks or characteristics of all conditioned phenomena. That they are dukkha, which we'll talk about because it's a problematic word to translate, but it's generally translated suffering. Dukkha, anicca, impermanence, and anatta, not self. And these are the fundamental realities of each sankhara, each moment of existence. So dukkha is, of course, very central and important in the Buddhist teaching. The Buddha said, "My teaching is all about dukkha and the ending of dukkha." And the formulation of the Four Noble Truths, which is fundamental to Buddhism, it was the Buddha's first formal teaching and encapsulates the whole of the teaching in brief, is all centered around dukkha. The first characteristic, the first truth is the truth of dukkha, then the truth of the origin of dukkha, the truth of the cessation of dukkha, and the way leading to the cessation of dukkha. Now, we generally translate dukkha as suffering, and in many contexts that works well, but it is a bit problematic in that the English word suffering is a bit too narrow. We have said that dukkha is a characteristic of each moment, of each conditioned phenomena, and that means that everything is in essence is dukkha. But we know from our own experience that not everything is suffering. It's true there is a great deal of suffering in existence, as birth, sickness, old age, and death are inescapable. But there are moments that we class as pleasure, and there are many, many moments. I think probably the majority of moments experienced by most sentient beings are neutral. They're classed as neither painful nor pleasurable, but they're all nonetheless dukkha. So dukkha means something more than just simple suffering. And I think there's two problems with that translation. One is that I've already mentioned, is that the word dukkha is universal, suffering is not. But the other problem is that suffering highlights the wrong side of the equation. It emphasizes the subjective quality, that we feel suffering subjectively. But dukkha is an objective characteristic of the phenomena themselves. That's quite important to understand. It's not something that we impose on reality by our mind, either by misperception or otherwise. It's inherent. It's integral to each moment of existence. It's dukkha. The Visuddhimagga, in attempting to define dukkha, uses a literary method that's common in the commentaries. Is a kind of imaginary etymology, trying to explain the word by playing with the roots of the word. And there are actually a few of these given for dukkha, but one of them means something like out of true or misaligned, and gives the image for this as if you have a wagon wheel and the hole in the middle of the wagon has been worn, or it was built improperly in the first place, and it's not truly round. It's off kilter. It's off center. It's, the wheel will never turn properly, and the wagon will always give a rough ride. So I think this points to an important aspect of the concept of dukkha, is the imperfection of things. That nothing is complete or without flaw in its own immediate essence. This is related to the concept of conditionality, that everything only exists as a condition of other things. So that nothing exists as a self-existent entity. And with the any Dhamma or that you want to isolate, any objective phenomena, whether it's internal, external, near or far, whatever, mind or matter, you can't ever completely isolate it. It always exists in relation as a cause and as a condition, as part of a network or matrix of other things. So in that way, we could say that any given phenomena is a work in progress. It's something incomplete, imperfect, just a passing flux of energies from elsewhere. So nothing is a perfect little gem. Everything is flawed. It's imperfect in some way. One translation that has been suggested for dukkha is unsatisfactory. And again, that has some merit, but again, it has the problem of highlighting that subjective side. So sometimes I've seen this as unsatisfactoriness, which is a hell of an unwieldy word, but is probably a bit better in its meaning, because the aspect of dukkha means that the phenomena are objectively or inherently incapable of satisfying the mind. And this is quite important. It's an underpinning of the whole process of samsara. That at the root level, what samsara is, taken down to the most finest grain of examination possible, samsara is the mind taking an object, finding that the object does not satisfy it, and leaves it craving, so it immediately goes forth to try and take another object. There's a kind of inherent drive in the unenlightened mind to find completion or satisfaction in the objects. And because the objects are dukkha, they are inherently incapable of satisfying the mind. The mind cannot be satisfied with any object. It can experience momentary pleasure, that's a given, but it can't be satisfied, or it will still have the urge to take an object left because it hasn't completed itself, it hasn't found perfection. There's a Tibetan text which makes the argument that if there were anywhere in the cosmos, if there were one object that was fully satisfying, fully perfect, the universe would have ceased to exist long ago, because all consciousness would eventually find that object and never move again. So this is a dynamic that actually keeps samsara happening, is the mind seeking an object, taking an object, being unsatisfied, and seeking another object. This is the desire, the root addiction. This is the primordial addiction that the mind has been playing this losing game for countless lifetimes. And there's no possible way to satisfy consciousness with objects that are inherently dukkha. So dukkha is highlighted as the fundamental issue, as we see in the formula of the Noble Truths, all revolve around dukkha. Dukkha is what we are trying to transcend. And this is the third Noble Truth, that it is possible to transcend dukkha. But it's not possible to do that within the confines of samsara. Within the rules of that game, there's no possible way to win. It's like that old song, playing solitaire till dawn with a deck of 51. This is our situation in samsara. So there are three kinds of dukkha which are elaborated to take account of the different feeling tones associated with phenomena. Dukkha, dukkhata, which could be translated as dukkha as such, or dukkha per se, is the obvious one. It's the one that is clearly translated as suffering. It's poke in the eye with a sharp stick is clearly dukkha. There's no difficulty in understanding that. When painful physical or mental feelings arise, this is suffering. This is dukkha as such. Then there's a dukkha viparinama, which is the changeableness of things, which is the dukkha particularly associated with pleasurable phenomena, because whatever pleasure we experience with a phenomena, an object taken by the mind, it doesn't last, it can't persist, it falls away, it breaks up. So there's then suffering ensues. And the third is dukkha sankata, which actually applies to all kinds of dukkha, all kinds of feeling tone. It's dukkha as a characteristic, the inherent quality of dukkha. So it's the only one that applies to neutral phenomena. Dukkha is inherent in the object, which is quite important to understand. And when you understand these laws, it actually makes life a lot more pleasant. At one time, I was giving a public talk on this topic of dukkha, and somebody in the audience asked the question, why is it you Buddhists always talk about suffering all the time? This is, the question comes from the idea that Buddhism is a pessimistic religion. It's a gloomy religion. And so at first I give a flip answer. I said, no, it's not true. We don't just talk about suffering. We also talk about pain, misery, grief, and despair. But then I went on to, more serious answer about, as I'm talking this evening, about how dukkha is broader than suffering. And I think this exclusive translation of dukkha as suffering has led to this perception of Buddhism as being a negative religion. I also saw a related anecdote. I recall reading in a little book by Alan Watts that he had 2 or 3 paragraphs where he was criticizing Hinayana Buddhism, by which he means Theravada, as being life-denying and negative and so on. But then he was honest enough to put in a footnote where he said, nevertheless, I've traveled extensively in Southeast Asia, and I've never seen such happy people as Theravada Buddhists. And there's something a deep truth hidden in that, that if you understand the laws of Dhamma, you understand the nature of dukkha, you can enjoy the pleasant experiences more, because you're not projecting onto them the impossible demands of permanence or perfection. I recall experience I had in Thailand when I was the first year I was in Thailand. I was a novice monk, and we were staying at a retreat monastery called Pujongkam, and we were taking turns. I was the only novice, and there were 3 bhikkhus there, and we were taking turns doing a solitary retreat, where you didn't have to come for the group activities and just stayed by yourself. So you went for alms round to a different, smaller village on the other side of the mountain. And every morning at dawn during this 2-week retreat, I would get up and walk down this winding trail down the side of this mountain to the village. And it was exquisitely beautiful. It's overlooking the Mekong River, and at dawn there's the mist rising from the river. You can hear the village waking up, and across the river you can see the jungles of Laos. It was a really incredibly beautiful scene going down that mountain. And the first 2 or 3 days I did it, I felt, besides the appreciation of the beauty, I felt some sadness. And by the 4th or 5th day, I was asking myself, oh, what's the matter here? This is really a very exquisite experience. This is quite beautiful. Why is it tinged with sadness? And I realized that I was anticipating the loss of this experience, that it would only last for these 2 weeks and it'd be over. And then I thought, this is quite ridiculous. I am, corrupting this moment by anticipating its end. Whereas if I accept its impermanence and its unsatisfactory nature, its imperfection, and just go with it, just be in the present moment, then I can enjoy it fully. So understanding dukkha does not mean being a pessimist, being gloomy. It's first of all being a realist. You are fundamentally understanding and accepting the reality of samsara, seeing it for what it is, and then you can live at peace in it. And remembering the goal is to transcend it, to make an end of dukkha. On the way, we can have many experiences that we classify as pleasant, and we don't tinge them or corrupt them with unrealistic expectations. So dukkha is always with us. It's inherent in all phenomena. And as I'll go into this this aspect also with the other two characteristics, but each of the characteristics, when it's penetrated by the mind in depth, when it's fully known, fully understood, it transforms to becoming a gateway of liberation. That's how we break out of samsara, is by fully comprehending it. So each of the characteristics has a particular gateway associated with it, and the gateway for dukkha is called being a body witness, because dukkha is most obvious in the body. And this is also found in another teaching about the three characteristics, that there are particular ways in which the characteristics are hidden from us, so they're not self-evident immediately to the unenlightened, untrained person. And for the other two characteristics, the ways of obscuring them tend to be a bit cognitive. There's the illusion of, which I'll get into these when we go into the other characteristics, but for impermanence, it's the illusion of continuity, and for not self or emptiness, it's the illusion of compactness. So there's kind of philosophical sort of or cognitive misunderstandings. But for dukkha, the way it's hidden is said to be change of postures. So it's very visceral, down to earth, related directly to the body. We don't experience dukkha in the body without, normally, in day-to-day life, we don't experience dukkha without attempting to evade it by fidgeting. There's a story about a woman teacher in Burma who, one of her methods, she was a lay woman who taught the Vipassana, and one of her methods when a student came to see her was to have them sit in a comfy chair, and before she began talking, and she'd say, just take your time, make yourself comfortable, no rush, make sure you're really comfortable. And then she'd ask them, are you now perfectly at ease? Are you perfectly comfortable? And they'd say, yes, thank you. And then she'd start speaking, and it wouldn't take more than maybe 5, at the most 10 minutes, and the person would change their postures. They'd cross their legs or shift their weight to the other arm or something. And she would pounce on them. What are you doing? You said you were perfectly comfortable. How come you're moving now? If you were comfortable, why would you need to move? Right. And she's pointing this out, that we fidget, we to rearrange the constellation of dukkha in the body so that it's not evident. It's not an end of dukkha, but it's a rearrangement. So a change is as good as a rest, they say, and the new constellation for a few minutes is not noticed as dukkha. This is why beginning meditators commonly have one of the big hurdles that they face in the early going is pain in the body. It's because this is probably the first time in their lives that they've been fully awake and conscious and attempting to be still without moving. And they don't find the option so available to fidget, to move away from the dukkha. So this can be interpreted quite literally, that change of postures, but it also has a metaphorical meaning applied to the mind, that we mentally fidget away from dukkha. We shift and twist and turn in our mind to avoid painful experience in the mind, and the same as we do physically in the body. Now, the experiences of pleasure and pain are felt either in the body or in the mind. They're all ultimately, in the last analysis, they're in the mind, but the body experiences pain and pleasure quite directly. This is a teaching from Abhidhamma, that of the six senses, only the mind sense and the body sense actually experience pleasure and pain. That what we could think of as, say, a pleasant taste is actually, at the moment of tasting, it's neutral, but then the mind identifies it. The mind object identifies this as a pleasant taste. So that's why we have phenomena like acquired taste, learning to enjoy a food that previously you didn't like. Or we have the saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, because an object is not inherently beautiful or ugly, and the eye sense or eye consciousness doesn't distinguish those characteristics. But when sanya has got a hold of it, and then consciousness has got a hold of it, it's then identified as being either beautiful or ugly. So pain and pleasure are felt in the body through the sense of touch, or in the mind through appreciation or dislike of objects. So dukkha is always with us, and it has some very obvious forms in that merit the identification as suffering. And these are ones that are, for example, highlighted in the First Noble Truth, in the form of the First Noble Truth. There is birth, sickness, old age, and death are all suffering. We can use the word suffering quite confidently here. Being separated from what you like is suffering. Being attached to what you dislike is suffering. Pain, grief, misery, and despair are suffering. And then, in short, the five aggregates of clinging are suffering. So we just finished talking about the five aggregates, and all the five aggregates, being samsaric, being conditioned, are imbued with dukkha. And it's this term, the final term of the definition, the five aggregates associated with clinging are dukkha, that recognize the universal aspect of dukkha, the inherency in the objects. But the first part of the definition points to the gross existential dilemma of sentient beings: birth, sickness, old age, and death, which are the realities that led the Bodhisattva to seek liberation in the first place. And these are stark realities that we are all subject to, that we don't escape within the bounds of samsara. It's only by making an end of samsara, by realizing the Nibbana, that we make an end of birth, sickness, old age, and death. So I think that that sufficiently covers the ground for dukkha, and we'll see. I'll happy to stay on for some additional time and answer questions. Okay, here's a question. Some Buddhists claim the opposite to what you said in the beginning. Dukkha is not inherent in objects, but only our tendency to grasp and cling. Is this not true, considering the arahants are free of dukkha by having overcome clinging? Well, the arahants are not beyond dukkha as long as they're still alive. They are beyond the subjective aspect of dukkha. They do not have mental suffering, but they still subject to the inherent imperfection of things, and even to the grosser forms of sickness and death. The Buddha, in his last life, experienced, in his last year of life, experienced some considerable physical pain with illnesses that were overtaking him. That the objective side of dukkha is not overcome while one is still in a corporal body. Still before parinibbana, there's still the objective dukkha, but the arahant is free of the subjective mental suffering. I think it's a wrong interpretation to say that dukkha is something we project onto reality. I think it's inherent in the objects. When I try to contemplate the present moment, my mind feels some kind of disgust or restlessness and changes to past or future. This is dukkha. Yeah, it's certainly an aspect of dukkha, that this is the change of postures. You're trying to contemplate the present moment. It's unpleasant, so you run away to the past or future. So you're fidgeting mentally. You're not being still. So it's a way of not looking at dukkha, of escaping from it or hiding it. But it doesn't end it. You don't get away from it that way. Is it skillful for one to enjoy their blessings in this human existence? Should one consider pleasant weight and not unpleasant as much as one can in order to avoid underlying tendency to sensual desire? No, I don't think that. I don't think that's necessary. That kind of strategy can be useful for one who's really caught in sensual desire, to really emphasize the dangers inherent in sensuality and see the negative aspect of it. But if you are able to enjoy a pleasant moment, say seeing a beautiful sunset, without clinging, and this is why kind of very often natural phenomena like that is the most harmless kind of pleasure, because you can't really claim ownership of a sunset, right? So there isn't really a place for the grasping, but the mind can still handle it unskillfully. But if you take it as just the resultant, this is just a moment, a pleasant moment, and neither cling to it nor reject it, but just be with it for a moment, then that's there's no harm done, and it's not in itself causing you to be bound to further becoming. It is the identification and clinging to experience that causes that. Can desire for nibbana be associated with dukkha? That would, it's possible for people to have a wrong understanding. I think if people have that a desire that and clinging for nibbana, they have a misunderstanding of nibbana. Whereas taking nibbana as a goal is different. Now, there are in Pali two words that we translate indifferently as desire, but they're quite different actually in the Pali, as tanha and chanda. Tanha is the word used in the formula for the second noble truth, and it's always spiritually negative. It's the thirst, literally, for existence, for sensual pleasure, and for non-existence, the three kinds. But chanda is more general. It's an impulsion of the mind towards something, and it's either positive or negative depending on the object. So kama chanda is desire or impulsion towards sensuality, and that's negative. But there's also dhamma chanda, which is the impulsion towards liberation, towards higher consciousness, and towards nibbana, and that's positive, and it's even quite necessary to make progress to have dhamma chanda. So let's go on here. Some time ago, poet Emily Dickinson wrote, "Pain has no future but itself." I find this quite striking. Any further thoughts, Ajahn? Is this a useful insight from the realm of poetry? Yeah, this relates to something else that I've heard said, that the subjective experience of suffering is really inherent in not being in the present moment, by projecting into the future. That we can endure any excruciating torment for one instant, that it's not going to overwhelm us. But what makes it feel overwhelming is you're thinking, oh, how long is this going to last? How much longer do I have to endure? But if you're just presently in the present moment, then which is quite a feat if you're in some great state of suffering, to just remain centered in the present moment, then anything can be endured. Everything specifically lacks the capacity to endure into the next moment through its own volition. Yeah. Okay. So there isn't really a question there. That's I don't see anything wrong with that. Okay. Next one. Does complete eradication of ill will, i.e., aversive reaction to dukkha, occur on the level of sanya? Is the person, i.e., the person informs their perception in such a way that does not perceive repulsiveness? Yeah, well, there is. Okay, that's a little bit nuanced, because as I said, the body does experience pleasure and pain directly, immediately. If you put your hand on a hot stove, that's a painful sensation. That's not a learned response or a quality of perception. It's painful. It's directly, immediately painful. But with the other senses, they are mediated by sanya, and you can perceive the repulsive and the unrepulsive, and vice versa. And this is said to be actually one of the qualities of an arahant, that they can perceive the beautiful in the unbeautiful, and the beautiful often socially unacceptable to be equanimous or happy, especially in work or family situations. We can't always, we can't abandon always the situation. Any advice? Yeah, I mean, if you're truly, truly equanimous and calm, you have it's a better internal position. If there's something terrible happens and you're able to just deal with it in a calm way. But if other people around you perceive you as being cold or uh, indifferent to their suffering, that can cause a uh, social friction. So you have to try and still be sympathetic to people, but don't necessarily have to get sucked into the negative emotions of those around you. Difficult as it may be, it's inner strength if you can resist that. In the Vedana Samyutta, there's this discourse on the abyss of pain. If you're familiar, is that word in Pali Dukkha? And if so, can you speak a bit on that? I think it is. I'm not 100% sure on the context of that. I think it is in Pali Dukkha, but I'm not sure. Um, and I really don't want to comment on that I'd have to go and look it up and get the full context. I don't recall the details of that. How do we abandon the feelings of desire towards another being? There are different ways of doing that. One is to again playing with perception, to perceive the body in its repulsive aspects. Like the 32 parts of the body highlight things like blood and guts and bones and marrow, sinews. If you realize that the body that you're desiring is a skin bag filled with messy, stinky, oozy bits. If it were cut open, it would be quite disgusting to look at. That's one way of distancing yourself from a sensual desire for a body. But if enlightenment is accomplished, existence remains the same, anicca, anatta, and dukkha, regardless of the stage of experience. Yeah, the external reality, samsara, is still as it is, but one now sees it. If one were fully enlightened, one would see that clearly and have no attachment to it, and would allow one to experience the unconditioned, which is not that. Consciously being aware of dukkha as primary content hidden in objects is an important step towards liberation. Yes, yeah, this is the whole program of vipassana meditation is really seeing the three characteristics in the objects. How do the characteristics of jhana compare to the characteristics of dukkha? Well, jhana is not liberation. It's still, so even the mind in jhana is still subject to dukkha. There's still an imperfection there, but this is also a good reason why we can't call it suffering, because the mind in jhana is not suffering in any way, but there's an imperfection inherent, because although you could say that samsara is reduced and that the sense desire level has been transcended, one is still in existence, still has a conditionality. So there's still a more subtle, refined form of dukkha present even in jhana. Any advice for one living with an immediate family member who has severe depression, such things as witnessing their suffering, accepting it? Yeah, that's a very difficult situation. I'm sorry that that's there. It's hard. It's hard to uh, help someone out of depression. Um, it would first of all be you have to be on guard not to get sucked into those downward spirals yourself. But if in any way you can help a person to get who's in a depressive state to get out of themselves, um, to be more active. Depression tends to be in a very self-centered kind of mind state. You know, it's the abyss of the spiral down the drain of poor me, oh woe is me. And if you can get them relating to others and being active, I've found that service is a very good active service of others is a very good antidote for depressive states. Uh, can an arhat still feel physical dukkha? Yeah, we've answered that I think a couple of times already. Yes, they can. But it doesn't disturb their mind. They don't feel the mental aspect. Okay, so let's see. Well, here's another question before we cut it off. Did the Buddha say something about why samsara is the way it is? Why is it the nature where dukkha can arise? Well, the Buddha specifically cautioned against trying to speculate about the ultimate origins of things. He's looking at the dynamic of how things actually are, not how they got this way or why. And it may be no answer to that question, but just the reality of things, that the condition phenomena. By I think on a kind of a metaphysical level, you could say that because things come into existence, then they're inherently immediately broken by being manifest. That the emptiness, the void, is the full potential. Because it's completely empty, it also has infinite potential. But as soon as something is manifest, it has a limited fraction of that. And it's like a broken shard. So it's always going to be some suffering just in existence and manifestation. Do you think we can compare samsara to a defective machine that is impossible to fix as an example of dukkha? Yeah, that's the analogy of the cart with the wheel that's not true. I mean, a machine that's got something wrong with it that's still kind of chugging along imperfectly. And that's actually having some background in, like I was an electronic technician. I've got a little bit of background in that kind of engineering field. There is always the in any kind of either mechanics or electronics, anything like that, there's always a impossible ideal. You know, when you're studying how something works, you can have like an imaginary example where every component is perfect, but you never find that in reality. There's never anything perfect. There's no ideal machine. It's always going to be some little imperfections. Is the cultivation of reflection on the three marks a skillful practice for a layman during daily life? Yes, certainly. Yeah, that's something to be brought to mind often, and to notice and resist the opposite tendency, the tendency to see things as other than dukkha, anicca, anatta. To imagine things as substantial or permanent or perfect. That's called the vipallasa, or hallucination. Okay, so I think I'll take my leave there, and next week I'll be back. We'll talk about impermanence, anicca. So glad to see you all. I see Damawaro was checked in. Very good to hear you, that you're there. It's old, very old friend of mine.